Okay, let me get going. My name is Mark Kramer, Director of Cold War Studies here at Harvard, and I have the pleasure of welcoming two people I greatly respect. One of them, Sergey Radchenko, I met initially about 20 odd years ago in Central Square when we were in our interim quarters there.
I was much younger, but Mark, you have not changed. You look the same.
I wish. But anyway, Zhenya Albatz, I know, was out there for a while and remembers, I think, those interim quarters. I have to admit, I like them better than this building. But in any case, so Sergey has been a professor at numerous places, and now currently for the Johns Hopkins School of International Studies, Johns Hopkins University School of International Studies based in Bologna. But he frequently is in Washington as well. He has written several books, and the most recent of them is this very thick book called To Run the World, a phrase that comes from, as Sergey explains in the book, a phrase that Leonid Brezhnev used in a conversation with Richard Nixon. To Run the World, the Kremlin's Cold War Bid for Global Power, which I think is a pretty good summary of it. Of what the book covers, although it's such a rich book that it could have other subtitles as well. And then my colleague here, Serhii Plokhy, whose name I like to pronounce correctly, unlike his publishers who want him to change it. And Serhii has written many books, both about Ukrainian history and Russian history, but going back a long way. But then in the last 15 years or so has published several important books about Cold War topics. And he is the director of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute and a professor here, and has been a professor here for, I guess, about 15, 16 years. And in the history department. So Sergey will start out with a presentation, a fairly brisk presentation of the book, touching on some of its main themes, and then Sergey will offer a commentary on it. So please, Sergey.
Thank you, Mark. It's lovely to be here. I talked about my book yesterday, and I'm talking about it today. And I have to say that about a week ago, I was also at Harvard, also talking about my book. So in the space of 2 weeks, Harvard is getting 3 installments of Radchenko, which is as much as anybody can tolerate anyway. I think probably much more than that. But it is a privilege to be here and to discuss To Run the World, which is a book that took 10 years to write. I promised myself not to write books like that again. Well, maybe sometimes occasionally you have to. I mean, one of these days, maybe I will try another project like this. But this took 10 years. And the reason it took 10 years is that the process of research for this book overlapped with the remarkable openness, archival openness in Russia, in China, where I lived for about 5 years. And I have had this opportunity to enrich this book with substantial new evidence about different episodes from the history of the Cold War that we thought we knew everything about, but there's still a lot out there that we did not know, and maybe, certainly there's still a lot that we do not know, but the wealth of available new materials allows us to go deeper on some of the key issues that define the Cold War. As I was going through this materials, and I can later maybe describe, Mark, better than anybody else what's out there. But as I was going through this enormous amount of materials in the Russian archives, and also in the Chinese archives, I realized that that they allowed us to write a history of the Cold War from the standpoint of the people who made the key decisions during the Cold War, i.e. the Soviet leaders, but there is a lot of China in the book. I keep bringing China in. China is certainly there. Let me focus on the Soviet side to begin with. So we have people like Stalin, Nikita Khrushchev, Leonid Brezhnev, Yuri Andropov, Konstantin Chernenko, Mikhail Gorbachev. We have those people who were obviously the Soviet decision makers and who left a massive amount of documentary evidence behind, which is now accessible or used to be accessible in Moscow up until the outbreak of war. I think it's still accessible if you dare, so to speak. I don't recommend that anybody goes there and allows themselves to be taken hostage by the Russian government. But certainly for a time, Mark, you remember that time we were spending months really in those archives, just pouring through this thousands and thousands of documents, like records of conversations that those leaders had with their colleagues or with foreign leaders, their various party speeches, their various internal memoranda. And as quantity turned to quality, one thing I realized is that, remember that famous statement by Wojciech Masny that the big surprise was that there was no surprise, and that the Soviet propaganda basically reflected the way the Soviets were thinking. I discovered for myself that this is actually not the case. This was not the case, and in fact, the way that they operated and the way they approached key problems of war and peace and Soviet foreign policy actually diverged significantly from Soviet propaganda. And so I mapped out this story of Soviet leadership and discovered in the process that one thing that they really wanted above all else was the recognition of their greatness by rival centers of power. Now, there were different kinds of recognition, different kinds of audiences. Of course, the key recognizer always was, and I still remains, to make a connection to the present, the United States. I think the Russians always saw the United States as the key, the big recognizer out there. Of course, it still raises the question of what kind of recognition did they want? Did they want recognition as America's partners in crime, so to speak, or, to cite the title of the book, did they want to run the world together with the United States? And it seems that sometimes they did. Sometimes they did, and this was especially evident at different turns in the history of the Cold War, most obviously during the mid-Brezhnev years overlapping with detente. So sort of 1972, 1973, this is when Leonid Brezhnev really decided to put ideology to the side and really embraced Richard Nixon with great love and passion that you would expect from somebody like Leonid Brezhnev, a very charismatic personality until he declined into senility, which is how we remember him wrongly, I think. In fact, I think this book contributes a little bit in the way of rehabilitating Brezhnev, not rehabilitating him in the sense that it covers for his various crimes, such as approving the invasion of Czechoslovakia and so on and so forth, but no, rehabilitating him as an active individual who was pursuing foreign policy and pursuing what he thought benefited the Soviet Union and his own status as a leader of a great power very well, actually, until about 1974. And then he really dropped off the grid, really declined very quickly. And the bureaucracy took over, the deep state. I don't use that word in the book, but the deep state took over and ran the Soviet Union for the subsequent however many years, while Brezhnev was in a condition in what?
9 years, I think.
Yeah, from 74 until November 1982, while Brezhnev, I don't want to say vegetated, but
Not.
But I mean, we remember what kind of Brezhnev, we remember late Brezhnev was a sad sight to see. But then going back to what you want to be recognized as, let's set aside this question of being recognized by, right? Being recognized by America, that's very important. I'll come back to this. But going back to this question of what do you want to be recognized as, there's another possibility, and that is that you want to be recognized as potentially a great rival of the United States, because that also has a legitimating aspect for you. And one thing I noticed was that somehow this question of domestic legitimacy was very important for the Soviet leaders. I never quite figured or understood why. I think it's probably because of the inherent lack of legitimacy or deficit of legitimacy in the Soviet Union. The economic basis for legitimacy started to deteriorate already in the late 1950s, early 1960s, and never really came back by the late 1960s. The Soviet leaders knew that their promise to build this wonderful paradise on earth for Soviet citizens, it was just not going to happen. In 1968, Yuri Andropov sent a famous memorandum to Leonid Brezhnev, in which he effectively said, look, we are losing the Cold War because we're not investing in R&D. We're not investing in education. Our labor efficiency, is that the word? Labor, the efficient, I'm mistranslating here. I think labor efficiency is the word. Labor efficiency is lower than much lower than American, and we're not using computers. At that time, by the way, the Soviets were all into copying the American computer revolution. It's actually hilarious. There's a fantastic memorandum, and now I'm going into nitty-gritty details from guess who? Anatoly Dobrynin, which I don't think I use in the book, but I'll just tell you this funny story. So Anatoly Dobrynin, of course, know him as a famous ambassador, back channel, et cetera, et cetera. He writes this memorandum to his bosses in Moscow, saying, look, the Americans are using computers in everything, including in their foreign policy. And I have heard that they have a special system for figuring out foreign policy with the help of computers. You just put in all the information and it gives the result, and you know what to do. So he said, we also need to have this kind of system. And it seems like the Soviets for a time really thought that they could bring about socialism by, building more computers, or at least, copying or breeding computers from the West. And their project was bailed out for a time by higher oil prices. Now, they did not benefit. It's a common misconception, which I repeat in the book. But I've since decided that this is actually a problematic take, and that is that the Soviet Union effectively benefited tremendously from the oil revolution in the 1970s. Of course, they benefited in the sense that oil became very pricey. They could sell it, and they sold it to Western Europe. Even as far away as Iceland. Fun fact, Iceland, during the Cold War, Iceland took its oil from the Soviet Union. Would you believe that? Member of NATO. But anyway, so the Soviets sold this oil, and then they imported grain to maintain the quality of life. They also imported equipment, which could then allow them to achieve breakthroughs on the economic front, breakthroughs that never happened, by the way. But the reason I say that it perhaps was not as important as I previously thought is because the Soviet economy itself was very energy intensive. So much of the energy that they were at that time producing in places like Tatarstan, but increasingly in Western Siberia, actually went to satisfy domestic needs, and also the needs of their allies in Eastern Europe, which just basically begged for oil and gas. And they had to deliver. The Soviets had to deliver. So all of which is to say that the economic promise of socialism was really faltering by the late 1960s. In the 1970s, it became very clear that you could not derive legitimacy from this. And I think this is where Brezhnev came in with his idea of legitimacy through being recognized by the United States as a great power. Hence his relationship with Nixon, hence this idea of running the world together as a partner of the United States. At the same time, there's another type of recognition, that is, you can be recognized as a great adversary of the United States. And I think this example, one example that I'll give you that also comes out of the book, is Nikita Khrushchev's love and hate relationship with President Eisenhower. So on the one hand, he wanted to be recognized by Eisenhower, by the Americans, and we know all these great stories about how he, when he was first invited in September 1959 to the United States, how he worried about going to Camp David because he thought there was some kind of a place where they put away, quarantined visitors, etc. I thought it was an affront to the Soviet glory, and we know the story about how Khrushchev rejoiced over this airplane that in which Frol Kozlov came to the United States, where the Americans did not have the ladder long enough to allow him to disembark. For Khrushchev, it's such a glorious opportunity. I mean, he wanted to be seen as an equal of Eisenhower, and I think at one point, I mean, if you look at the Camp David discussions, I think he managed to more or less kind of find common ground with him on some issues. And yet, then we come to the Paris summit in May of 1960, and things just explode in a major way. And the conventional interpretation of this is that they explode in a major way because Gary Powers is shot down over the USSR, and Khrushchev sees that as a humiliation. He goes there and demands that Eisenhower apologizes. Eisenhower refuses to apologize. Hence, we have this huge thing. But as I show in the book, actually, it's a little bit more complicated. And in fact, Khrushchev already knew that he couldn't get the kind of concessions from Eisenhower that would allow him to stand tall and proud and tell everyone that the Soviet Union was effectively, that the Americans kind of bowed down before the reality of Soviet greatness. And so the Gary Powers incident was more of an excuse than a real reason for Khrushchev blowing up in Paris. And there's some interesting documentation that confirms that, I think. But when that happened, when the blow-up happened in Paris, then Khrushchev also derived a degree of legitimacy from this, because he now could say, look, I stood up to Eisenhower, and I stood up to American imperialism, and they recognize us as this great adversary with whom they have to contend. So there are two different types of recognition as a partner and recognition as an adversary. And sometimes the Soviets tried to do both at the same time, not seeing the contradiction between the two. And that was, that was an interesting element that I discovered through the process of writing. The second thing that I wanted to talk about is recognition exactly by whom. And I mentioned the United States as the main recognizer, and there's just no doubt that America mattered above all else, as the country, as a great power, as the superpower that was able to grant that legitimacy that the Soviet Union and Soviet leaders so badly craved. But they were not the only place, not the only audience that mattered to the Soviet leaders. I show in the book that, among others, China mattered a great deal. And in fact, the Chinese aspect, which I think was historically underplayed by scholars working on the Cold War. Not that it was entirely underplayed. No, of course, people have written about it. But what I do in the book is I bring China more prominently to the center in arguing that in almost every decision that major decision of the Cold War that the Soviet leaders made, whether they were pursuing policy towards the United States or the Third World and so on, they thought about China because they wanted China's approval. Or at least they wanted to challenge China's criticism or reject Chinese accusations that they were selling out the Third World. And this played out in bizarre ways. And I'll give you one example where I think it's very interesting, where sometimes it's implicit, but sometimes I think maybe I stretched my evidence a little bit to argue my case. But I find the Cuban Missile Crisis an interesting example of this. So the Cuban Missile Crisis in general has, when we talk about the reasons why Nikita Khrushchev decided to send missiles to Cuba, there are basically two prevalent explanations. The first explanation that has been popular with historians of the Cuban Missile Crisis forever, especially in the United States, is the explanation about the strategic problem the Soviet Union faced. Despite promising to stamp out missiles like sausages, the Soviet Union did not have, by the early 1960s, the kind of missiles that would allow it to effectively threaten the United States. It did have ICBMs, as we know. Of course, it tested the first ICBM in the summer of 1957. But those ICBMs were not super reliable. They were liquid propelled and, very vulnerable to strikes. And so the argument goes, Khrushchev needed to address this strategic problem by placing missiles close to American shores and in effect do what the Americans were able to do with their missiles in Turkey and Italy. Is there evidence for it? I think there's evidence for it. think there's evidence for it because at one point Khrushchev said something like, "Oh, we will give the Americans a little of their own medicine," or something like that, in reference to those missiles that he was sending to Cuba. But then in the 1990s, as many of you would know, because you were involved in that research and in those conversations that were taking place in the early 1990s, when the Soviet participants of the Cold War began to tell their stories, we had people like, for example, Sergey Radchenko, who presented a different set of arguments, saying actually it was not about strategic problems at all. It was something else entirely, and that was Khrushchev wanted to save Cuba from American intervention. And he had good reasons to do that, because look at what Americans did. The Americans did in the Bay of Pigs. Clearly, there was something to it. Now, is there evidence for it? I argue in the book, I show in the book, yes, there's evidence for it. In fact, on a couple of occasions throughout 1962, Khrushchev talks about it. He talks about the need to save Cuba, both as he makes the decision to send missiles to Cuba, so we're talking here about May 1962, and also in October 1962, when they discuss this in the Presidium, when the whole thing blows up, there's a discussion in the Presidium when Khrushchev says something like, "Oh, we just wanted to save Cuba," or "We just wanted to help Cuba, so to make sure the Americans do not invade." So there is evidence for this point of view as well. So I basically, and this is where I come back to China, and you'll say, well, what could China potentially, conceivably actually matter in this scheme of things? And I argue in the book that it mattered a great deal, because you have to see the context here. And the context is the Sino-Soviet competition for influence in the global communist movement and in the third world. And Khrushchev felt very sensitive about being accused by China of betraying the communist movement. He would talk about this on every occasion when he could, saying, "Well, why did the Chinese keep claiming that we're doing this or that we're selling out the communist movement? This is totally not the case. Look, we are sending submarines to Indonesia. We're helping the Yemenis and Cuba, that is where it's at, right? Cuba is very important. And so he wanted to, when we're talking about why he was so worried about losing Cuba, that's because of that. He was worried that it would undermine Soviet credibility. It's not just because, as Mikoyan said, that here was a country that had a communist revolution and that, quote unquote, made us feel like boys again. I think that's not the explanation. The explanation is you lose Cuba, you lose your credibility, and the Chinese will exploit that credibility, and that undermines the Soviets everywhere. And so you see that again and again. And after he obviously backed off in Cuba, he had this long exchange with the Cubans. Mikoyan, of course, famously went there, and then we have all these letters from Khrushchev to Castro.
Very quickly, let me just interject. When Sergey just referred to Mikoyan there, he was referring to Anastas Mikoyan, who was one of Khrushchev's chief aides. The Sergey Mikoyan was Anastas's son, who collected a great volume of materials.
And published a fantastic book on this. Yeah, that's right. And so, one of the interesting things in the archives is you have those letters from Khrushchev to Castro that sometimes go for 30 pages and 40 pages, where he would just go on and say, well, why? How can you accuse us of selling out? How can you listen to the Chinese? You cannot believe them. What have they done for Cuba, etc.? And it's just so vivid. And that's why, I felt like I had to use that in the book. And again, China looms large there. It looms large again for Brezhnev. Brezhnev, when he pursues his détente first with the Europeans and later with the United States, his mind is fixated on China. And I show in the book just how, I don't know, is racist the wrong word here? How his conceptions were deeply Orientalist. I mean, one of the interesting things I found there was where he got his conception. I mean, look, where do Russians get their conceptions about China? I never read Orientalist literature when I was a kid, and I still got the same conceptions, which then had to be obviously overturned with time. But Brezhnev actually cites Orientalist literature when he talks to Nixon and explains why the Chinese cannot be trusted. And he cites a 19th century Russian explorer of China. Says, he had written back then that the Chinese cannot be trusted. They're so unreliable, and they will stab you in the back, etc. So you have this kind of stuff, and sometimes Brezhnev really descends to blatant racism, and somehow he thought that he and Nixon could find a common language and speak to each other because they were both European. And he actually said that, right? He said, "Oh, I'm talking to you as a European to European." To Nixon. So Nixon was a European, Brezhnev was a European, but not the Chinese. No, you have to be careful about the Chinese. So that is another interesting aspect. China loomed large for Brezhnev as well. Where does all of this lead? So obviously the book covers the period from 1943-44. That's where I begin. All the way to the present. The last chapter / epilogue actually covers the 1990s and Putin's years. And that is something that we cannot really have any definitive pronouncements about quite yet because the archival base is simply not there, although it is starting to appear for the 1990s. So 1990s can now be studied as a distinct historical period, although not perhaps using the Russian archives quite yet. But anyway, I take it all the way to Putin, and I try to see those continuities from the Cold War to the present and find that this craving for respect and recognition by rival great powers is something that does not change throughout the Cold War. It actually precedes the Cold War in many ways and goes back to Russia's imperial past. And it also outlives the Cold War. So even as the Cold War ends and we think that we're in a new, brave new world where everybody will be happy hereafter, turns out that those same cravings for respect and for recognition as a great power still drive even Yeltsin. He's hoping for that, and then certainly drive Putin's foreign policy. And that brings us to Russia's unfortunate predicament today, and its renewed neo-imperialist urge to control its neighbors. And I think I will stop here.
Okay, thank you very much, Sergey. Sergey.
Thank you, Sergey. And huge congratulations on writing and publishing this book. I really enjoyed it and found a lot of things on different levels, from conceptual to the facts that are important, like Brezhnev reading this book on China. That was a shocker for me. I remember Brezhnev, for me, he was already late Brezhnev, an embodiment of anything what was wrong about the Soviet Union. So he was very Soviet. The idea that his ideas on China were coming from the pre-1917 writings was really very interesting. I put this book I use it sort of for now as a bookend in a particular way to the historiography of the Cold War that starts with Judge Cannon's Long Telegram. Because in some themes it seems to me, are about Cannon, and I just quote for you here what he was writing. At the bottom of Kremlin's neurotic view of world affairs is traditional and instinctive Russian sense of insecurity. He writes about Russian ruler, first about the Russian agriculturalists who were insecure because of nomadic neighbors, and then I quote, Russian rulers have invariably sensed that their rule was relatively archaic in form, fragile, and artificial in its psychological foundation. That's the Long Telegram. And then in the X article that he publishes in the Foreign Affairs, he puts less emphasis on the Russian imperial history and agriculturalists and Russian elites, and more on the communist ideology. Mm-hmm. And you are talking about elements of insecurity, especially when it comes to the relations with the United States. That's certainly one of the themes. You talk about ideology, but you reject ideological explanation, the way how I understand, and you're saying, okay, it's difficult.
Not entirely, but to a certain extent, yes.
It's difficult to really divorce and separate ideology from security, or legitimately recognize security, which means going, for example, to Yalta, where Stalin claims Eastern Europe on the basis of security, whether this is also an ideological grab or not, in line with Gilles, or it's so it is all of that is there at the same time. So for you, the key category, the way how I understand it, is about legitimacy, right? Which comes from outside, that comes from the West in particular, but also from other places as well. And I think that it is there in the book. I don't remember anymore whether it's formulated so clearly, but for me, it's there are quite different qualities to the relationship with the United States and broader with the West, where it's about equality and this striving for equality and this big plane that Khrushchev is coming in, and so on and so forth. And another thing, getting legitimacy from China or from the decolonization movements, which is not about equality, it's more like maintaining the leadership position. And then again, it still falls under the category and the umbrella of legitimacy. But I think that these are two things that are related but also different. And for me, the book was also very important in a sense that it fills the gap where we all talk about either the Soviet foreign policy or the Russian policy today, about this element that is not fully rational, the idea of punching above your weight and taking huge risks. And what your book did, it actually helped me to provide at least one possible explanation, a hypothesis of where that is coming from. Sort of when it comes to the West, a chip on your shoulder, sort of a particular complex of inferiority that you overcome all the time. And you are saying that there are two ways of doing that. One is adversarial, another is just to emerge as a partner, but as an equal partner. And Brezhnev Nixon, it's probably about equal partnership. The question for me, and basically what I will do now, really, in my comments, I formulate a couple of questions that you might want to engage in one way or not. But these are things that the good book provokes thought and thinking and raises questions, right? Before starting with the questions, I'll say that indeed it provides a lot of new material that has, of course, value in its own beyond just interpretation and the framework, how you look at it, and hypotheses that you put forward. China is certainly is there as an important part of the story. So it makes all the right check marks in terms of a good historical book, but again, most of what I will be talking about will be this interpretation. So one question that I have is, okay, if there is indeed the issue of gaining legitimacy and in the form of equality from the people outside, and in the context of the Cold War, first and foremost, the United States of America. How Cold War-ish is that? Is this also the story of interwar Europe, where the Stalin's legitimacy apparently was coming out of not decolonization, but communist ideology? And the idea of the world revolution, or revolution in one country, but one way or another bringing the world to communism. So as opposed to looking at the United States, or maybe that chip is there after the revolution of 1917, when the Soviet Union is actually kicked out and eventually kicked out from the League of Nations as well, but generally basically is not a candidate for being a member of the club, and now just attempts to get into the club and be treated like Nicholas II was treated. Or maybe it starts with not with chemical agriculturalists, but maybe it starts with Hitler and his really unhappiness about Europe that is still in knowledge from Russia, right? And not being allowed in. So I don't know whether this is the question that one can answer. But that's the question that I had. Okay, where does it start that you just out of your way take huge risks in the name for the sake of being recognized as equal? And I'm kind of a less maybe intellectually interested at this point at how you get legitimacy by being the leader. So at least for me, it's somehow seems to be more less interesting and more clear. And then another thing, another question that I have been thinking about while reading your book. So you can get that status of being equal by either getting into fight or being recognized as a member of the exclusive club. But what is, when you switch, what do you do when one thing doesn't work? Then you switch to another, and then you switch to something else, which means that is just a tactic, right? This is not the cause of why you behave that way. You just shift from left foot on the right and vice versa. But really, you want to achieve something else that basically limits the explanatory ability of your formula. So again, not to undermine it again, I love it, but that's another thing that I was thinking about because it's also very practical. Russia until a few weeks ago was an adversarial relationship with the United States. So if you want Russia to change the current behavior, what do you do? But to come up with that sort of recommendation, it would be good to have some idea why the shifts happen. Again, in response to unsuccessful foreign policy, but then okay, and the driving force of the foreign policy or the idea how you formulate it. And another question was about decolonization and Khrushchev. And you're saying that Khrushchev is there getting that legitimacy from decolonization. My guesses would be that's the same place where Stalin was getting his legitimacy in the 20s and 30s, but it was communist movement as opposed to decolonization. But then you're saying that, okay, the conditions are different. Stalin could not do that. And the first wave of decolonization happens on Stalin's watch. So what changed, right? And then Khrushchev becomes a player in the late 50s and early 60s. Is this the particular type of the equilibrium or balance of terror with the hydrogen bomb, or maybe there are some other explanations. So why Stalin is not there playing the game of decolonization that Khrushchev is playing? And absolutely last question, and it's a provocation, just a pure provocation. You were trained and you were writing on China, right? So now China is a big story, and we have a lot of China in that book. Is this because you were trained as a China expert and China is a big story, or this is because actually the Cold War really needs rethinking, and we really were missing that, and now your unique qualifications and also the time is right that we can get a much better and clearer picture of the Cold War, or we are distorting this Cold War because of the particular author and particular moment and when the book is written. So that is my Провокация.
Thank you, Sergey.
Thank you, Sergey. Let me actually, before you address Sergey's points, Sergey, let me just raise a couple of quick things. One, there were quite a few books published during the Cold War about Soviet foreign policy, and probably the best known of these was Adam Ulam's From Expansion to Coexistence. He gives a great deal of emphasis to China, almost excessive at times. He does cite China with regard to the Cuban Missile Crisis. There were numerous people who disagreed with him, but I don't think it's fair to say that the role of China was underplayed before.
To some extent, not it wasn't sort of central to the arguments.
Okay, well, with Adam, I think it was
in the way that I certainly tried to do this.
Well, again, he had no access to the kinds of documents that you had, so yours is a much richer account. But on certain key things like that, I think he got a lot wrong in the book, but he also got quite a bit that's right. And then, as Sergey mentioned, he and I overlapped numerous times in the Russian archives and Chinese municipal archives, et cetera. And so I deeply admire all the research he did, and I'm very glad he put together this book that allows him to present a lot of it. What I hope we will do, though, in the future is because I know he has a lot of material. It's a very long book, but is not in here. So I hope he will continue writing in the future. So
thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mark. And just to begin with this last point is indeed there's so much material, Mark. You know the problem. You accumulate hundreds of thousands of pages of documents, which I basically donated to the Wilson Center, and I think they translated quite a bit actually, and they've already put it out online, some of the translations at least. The areas which were remarkable, on which I collected a remarkable amount of documents, which I barely used, are the Middle East, which actually allows me in the future to write a history of the Soviet involvement in the Middle East or something like that if I ever get to it. And another one is something I don't even touch and barely touch in the book, in that's the situation in Chile in 1973. The amount of materials that we have from the Russian archives on this is just astounding. Also, Indonesia in 1965, remarkable, just a lot of materials. And I don't even think I even mentioned Indonesia 1965 in this book. And that is because obviously you cannot put everything in there. And they did present Cambridge University Press with a proposal. I said, well, what about doing a 3-volume work? Because I know people who have done that. And of course, they laughed me out of the room. So that did not go anywhere. But I could produce smaller volumes in the future, and I think that would be great. And that material is still, it's available. It's out in the Wilson Center. And it can be used by other scholars as well. Sergey, thank you for your really detailed and insightful, difficult questions, because you really drive into the heart of this book in a way that is only possible at this kind of seminars. And I know you wrote a very generous review of the book. So thank you for that. But here, I mean, you really you go into the kind of foundational issues that I struggled with when I was writing this book. I mean, how do you define ideology? How can you take ideology out of this and say that ideology did not matter when even if I say that the Soviets cared about the recognition of their leadership in the communist world, you cannot define the communist world without reference to ideology, because that's what the communist world is about, right? It's kind of built into the concept. So there is something to this. Let me start with your second question, and that is whether the striving for recognition is a tactic or a means, or whether it is an end in itself. I'll give you one interesting example, which I think helps clarify this question. We all know Chen Qian's work. on Mao's continuous revolution. He likes to talk about how Mao believed in continuous revolution, and whatever he did, whether it's the Great Leap Forward or the Cultural Revolution, and pursued that goal of continuous revolution. And so we have this debate with Chen Qian. I ask, what is the purpose of continuous revolution? Is it the building of a wonderful new society, heaven on earth, paradise on earth? Or is it bringing China to centrality in whatever this, paradise on earth that you build? China is still at the center of it. And I think Chen Jian and I agreed that bringing China to centrality is for Mao the key issue. And that can be, and then therefore you can describe continuous revolution as a means of getting to this, as a means of getting to this end. In other words, you pursue continuous revolution because you want to return China to centrality, and you pursue this, economic breakthroughs that Mao pursued in order to then claim that China has an economic basis for claiming its place at the center of the known universe, so to speak. So in this, I think in this sort of situation, you could argue, and I think I argue in the book, that ideology can be seen as instrumental to the pursuit of greater goals, but not instrumental in a cynical kind of way, but instrumental in a direct way. I mean, you want to achieve something, i.e. you want to achieve greatness, and you're trying to figure out how to get there. And how about, well, here and set different roads to getting there. You can get there by pursuing leftist communist agenda, or you can get there by doing something else, like pursuing reform and opening, like in the case of China. You could get there by promoting the global Soviet project, like Khrushchev and Brezhnev did vis-a-vis the third world, or you can get there by proclaiming universal human values, like Gorbachev did, and cutting off some of those projects in the third world. In other words, it's a question of the chicken and egg, or cart and horse, and what is means and what is an end. It's a difficult question, and I felt that in the end, this idea of self-actualization for these leaders, and here I'm deliberately borrowing terminology from the life of Maslow. Self-actualization is the ultimate thing you want to pursue. That trumped everything else, and the idea was to achieve the self-actualization through different means, and they tried to do that through different means. And when some means did not work, they would pursue other means. My favorite example, which I think I mentioned in the book, is Mao Zedong meeting Mobutu at one point. Mm-hmm. And so he tells Mobutu, he says, we used to support your enemies, i.e. the leftist revolutionaries fought against you, but they just cannot do anything. So we decided to support you instead, and that is a reflection of ultimate pragmatism right there. In other words, you're trying to figure out different ways of getting there. And when one set of means does not work, then you ditch this, including the ideological explanations, and you try something else. Consider again, and I like to, for the sake of argument, you stick with China. The late 1960s. This is the most remarkable period of most remarkable transformation. People who write about the Chinese Cultural Revolution highlight, Mao's pursuit of ideological ends, how he was absolutely convinced that he had to create this upheaval in China because he believed in it. It was a revolution, was so important, etc. And he broke with the USSR. For what reason? Because they disagreed over ideology. Ever since 1956, they had the big debate, who was revisionist and who was a dogmatist, etc. You get to the, and then of course throughout the 1960s, the Chinese accused the Soviet Union of selling out the revolution and trying to build up a partnership with the United States. We get to 1969, everything changes. And then Edgar Snow comes to China in the fall of 1970 and has a meeting with Mao, and is so surprised when Mao tells him, when you see Nixon, tell him that he's the greatest fellow in the world. And of course, the reason he said that was because he thought that Edgar Snow was a CIA agent, as we know. But Edgar Snow was basically a leftist intellectual journalist, so he was quite, himself perplexed by this characterization of Nixon as the greatest fellow in the world. And then you have this radical transformation of Chinese foreign policy, engaging with quote unquote American imperialists. And this conversation with, and this is where Chinese archives become so interesting, because this conversation with Edgar Snow was circulated to the party committees around the countries, and they were asked for their opinions, and they submitted the opinions to the party center, and the opinions read, if Nixon is the greatest fellow in the world, how come we're still quarreling with the Soviets? Are they worse than Nixon? You can just imagine Mao thinking, these people don't understand geopolitics. Anyway, if Mao was so committed to the revolutionary cause, then how is it that he suddenly decided to do what he had accused the Soviets of doing, effectively selling out and embracing American imperialism? And you can say, well, that was because of security concerns and Damansky and all of that thing, all of those things that happened in 1969, and there's something to it. But it also says something about the resilience of ideological tropes that you can, or the lack of resilience, if you can set them aside like this when you have the need to do so.
And Stalin does that.
Stalin does it all the time. Doesn't Stalin sell out Mao Zedong in 1945? I love this story, but I talk about it in the book where you have the Yalta Agreement, and David knows this story very well. And for years, we've been trying to figure out whether Stalin, secretly was supporting the Chinese communists in their revolutionary aspirations, or was he actually playing against them? And I think the evidence is pretty clear. In 1945, he was actually forcing Mao Zedong into a coalition government where Mao would be effectively dominated and pushed aside. And he actually did inform Malinovsky, as I said, this telegram in the book, where he writes to Rodion Malinovsky saying, when the Chinese communists try to take over cities in Manchuria, keep them out by force, because these people are trying to quarrel us with the Americans. They are trying to create a quarrel between us and the Americans. How ideological is that? Nothing. I mean, it's very pragmatic, very cynical, very cynical. So Stalin could also do that. Brezhnev could totally do that, as he did with Nixon, setting ideology inside. And I think at that point, by the way, ideology already became more of an empty word than before. And I'll get into this in a second, because I think that goes to your other question. But Brezhnev, and we see Chernyaev write about this in his diary, saying, look, we don't have, what ideology is a dead letter. We still keep peddling because we have to. But fundamentally, we have a different ideology, or Brezhnev does, and it's ideology of peace. We just want to promote peace, and we want this to be recognized as this country that helped promote peace and averted nuclear war. On this question of what does legitimacy derive from, and I think it is a very serious and deep and profound question that you posed here. There are different sources of legitimacy. First of all, let's talk about legitimacy and what is legitimacy. And this is so difficult because as a historian, I'm never used to doing that. I mean, historians don't do this kind of thing. Maybe some do. I don't know, Mark, maybe you do that. But I never used to do that. In other words, I would kind of use words without really thinking what they mean. But in this book, I tried to go a little bit deeper, and I tried to define ideology. And I even read some books by different authors and political scientists about how they define ideology. And there's one guy who defines 13 definitions of ideology. And so that's where I say that ideology could be defined in terms of security. In other words, you need the world to be red, and therefore you want to dominate it in order to be safe, and to make it safe for your ideology, or you can define security in ideological terms, i.e. you ultimately want security, but in order to be secure, you then impose your ideology, just as Gilles, as you mentioned, said in his book. So when you can use the security and ideology in this kind of ways and define one with reference to the other, all you get is something really super, super fuzzy. And I think when we have this, and I'm guilty of this myself with my dear friend Lawrence Luther, we used to debate this. We used to have this great debates about whether the Sino-Soviet split was caused by ideology or what was it? Ideology or national interest or something like that. We had those big debates, and if you actually drill into this, you realize actually there's it's a debate about nothing, because we don't define the terms, and it seems like we're arguing about the same thing. Actually, we could be agreeing instead of arguing. So all of this. So I talk about the definition of ideology in the book. I don't really spend that much time on the definition of legitimacy, except to say that legitimacy is something that combines elements of justice and legality. And I think this is Ian Clarke's definition, because he's got a book about this whole legitimacy in international politics or something like that. And so I do that, and I say, well, this basically refers to this notion that you hold your position not because you're just lucky to hold it, but no, because you deserve it. You deserve this position because you have special talents, or you're special great power. We see that with Khrushchev, where he had this conversation with Castro, which is my favorite example, where Castro asked him, why are you quarreling with the Chinese? And Khrushchev, I also don't know what we're quarreling with the Chinese about. We have this, they say that we have an ideological dispute, but actually we don't. Actually, in reality, it's about the fact that the Chinese want to play the first fiddle. I wanted to call the book The First Fiddle, but then this was denied by Cambridge University Press. At one point, they didn't like this idea. It sounds better in Russian, Первая скрипка, as opposed to, in English, it doesn't really make sense, maybe. Or maybe it does, I don't know. But anyway, and then Khrushchev goes into this discussion. It's hilarious. I don't know could I borrow that for a second? I'll just read it out to you, because this is one of my favorite things that comes out of that shows how Khrushchev thought about this his relationship with China. So this is not leadership, he says. Okay, he says, he asked me, Khrushchev talking about Castro, he asked me, what are our differences with China? And I said, that's exactly what I'm asking. What are the differences? I said, it's a question of nationalism, a question of egotism. This is the main thing. They want to play the first fiddle. And then he said, this is not decided by vote. This is determined by one's status and by the other's recognition. Even among friends, 5, 10 people are friends, and one of them is the leader. They don't elect him. They just recognize him for certain qualities. This is how it is and how it will be in the future. People won't all be black or red-haired. There will be different colors and different temperaments and different mental capabilities among people. There will be inequality like elsewhere in nature. And what is this? You read it. So basically what he's saying is, we are the leaders, and because we just deserve to be. We're just better. We're just more intelligent. That's why. What are they trying to do, the Chinese? What are they claiming? So this is quite revealing about this question of legitimacy and what how they felt that they deserved it. But as you said, Sergey, there are different sources of legitimacy. First of all, you can have domestic or ideational sources of legitimacy. For example, you say, well, we deserve what we have because we have this set of ideas. Let's say the United States of America. The United States of America feels that it's legitimate because it is, or it used to be at least, it's shining city on the hill, and it promotes certain values. And that makes us Americans feel legitimate. And that also legitimizes our global position and our position in the hierarchy, in the global hierarchy. We deserve it because we have values, and we basically bring them to the rest of you and ask you to adopt those values. So, right, this is kind of an ideational or ideological source of legitimacy, which I think is relevant. I mean, what I argue in the book is, yes, yeah, it was a relevant thing, but it's just the problem was that it never was enough for the Soviets to claim that, because they could not quite deliver on their promise. Yes, they sold this idea to the third world. They dumbed it down. They would say, well, we want to make you free, Arnie Westad, of course, famously argued that whereas the Soviets were an empire of justice, the Americans were an empire of equality. I think for the Soviets, it was actually more of we're both justice and equality. So follow us, and we'll make everybody more just and more equal. And that's a kind of a dumbed down version of Soviet ideology that I think sold quite well in the third world, because it made sense for those decolonizing countries that somebody would come and tell them, look, we're coming to liberate you. And also domestically, there were economic sources of legitimacy as well. Economic sources, when the Soviets were launching Sputnik into the skies, that showed that they had a claim that their ways of their worldview, their economic policies, their understanding of how the world functioned was actually legitimate and reasonable, because they were delivering on real goods, i.e. something was flying in the sky and it showed Soviet superiority. It's just that was not enough. And that started to really fall by the wayside by the early 1960s. When we have the Soviet decisions, or you know this very well because you've written a fantastic book about the Cuban Missile Crisis, but when the Soviets were making the decision to send missiles to Cuba, another thing that they were debating in the presidium at that time is the rights, food rights, and or the price rights in Novocherkassk, and what to do about those. They could not feed their people. They had to raise prices. By 1963, the Soviet Union was importing vast quantities of grain and had to sell off their gold reserves in order to do that. So this domestic economic basis for legitimacy, the ideological basis for legitimacy, started to fade, and they had to rely on this external legitimation so much more. And you see that in particular with Brezhnev, etc.
The irony is that they had chosen the same guy to deal with Novocherkassk and Cuba, General Pliev.
That's right. That's right. That's right. There is, well, there are lots of ironies. But anyway, yeah, exactly. So that's as far as the sources of ideology. By the way, today you still have in China that same situation because you have an economic basis of legitimacy, you have ideological basis for legitimacy, but fundamentally it's economic, right? It's economic, and when economy does not deliver, they have to look for something else, whether it's communist ideas and building a communist world. I don't think anybody buys this in China, or maybe it's making China great again and recovering Taiwan or something like that. I think a lot of people will buy that in China, i.e. nationalism making up for the deficit of legitimacy. And then external legitimation is also very, very important. So what I'm arguing in the book is not that external legitimation was it, the rest, did not matter. What I argue is that legitimacy was it. Legitimacy was really, really important, and the way that you obtain legitimacy also changed over time. It was just really, really a key issue that I think was understated. Not, as Mark likes to say, this was of course highlighted by various people in previous books and historiography, and the Garthov's book, for example, which is even thicker than this, actually speaks to that particular issue. And Deterrent and Confrontation actually does raise this question of American recognition. I think what I was able to do in this book is to bring new sources and maybe discuss that with new emphasis, and also emphasis on continuities, which is important. So finally, did I overblow China? And of course, did I over hype China, because China is a hyped up issue today? And maybe I did, and it does kind of make sense that, yes, historically I've worked in China, so it was natural for me to just be drawn to China-related issues. And the fact that I could use Chinese archive, Chinese sources extensively in this book also contributed to that, because it led me to emphasize the Chinese angle. I would actually say that I underemphasized it, because I initially wanted to do a proper, I wanted to give the United States, the Soviet Union and China equal places in the book. I wanted to do that, and
a strategic triangle.
Yes, I wanted to do that, and in the end, it was just too clever by half. I didn't know how to kind of link it together, and also how to sort of sell it from the publisher's perspective. So in the end, it really became.
But there is a need for a book like that about triangulation.
Maybe it's the next book. I don't know. But I could perhaps do that, and of course, I still have a lot of Chinese materials that I could draw on, and also it kind of maps out today as well, because quite unexpectedly, and I say that I think in the last paragraph in the book, and let me just also kind of just highlight this.
By the way, Sergey, I don't think you did overhype China.
You don't think
I thought you treated it sufficiently. What I said was Adam Ulam, I think, overemphasized it.
What, did I underhype it then?
No, I think he gave it its proper weight.
I mean, I could have tried to. I could have, like I said, at the beginning, I began writing this book when I was living in China, and I was so just consumed by China themes that I just wanted to, China was supposed to have a much bigger place in this. And then it kind of became secondary. And that is a case of following your sources, because I had this amazing access, and David knows this, and I had very, very good access in China to all kinds of sources. And then I thought, wow, this is great. We'll write all these books about China. It'll be wonderful. And then as Mark, mentioned, the Russians opened up their archives. And when when we saw what was there, you just realize, wow, this also is a story that has to be told. And then there's this American part of the story for the proper, third pillar, and that is something I don't know as much about, and that would have to rely on Ross or on the existing studies.
My opinion, actually, that you got China right. But again, despite the fact, as Mark said, that there were histories with China, histories of the Cold War before, but the bipolar interpretation of the Cold War really did injustice to many places in China in particular. Mm-hmm. And for me, discovery of China was through the Cuban Missile Crisis, that it was elephant in the room on so many levels, because Khrushchev could lose Cuba not just to the Americans, but also to the Chinese.
Exactly, and so that is the key issue.
He was saving it from two competitors.
Yeah, and of course, I forget to answer your third question, and that is, why did Stalin not take advantage of the beginning of decolonization? I think we have an answer for this in Stalin's own comments on the likes of Nehru, for example. He thought that Nehru, as he called him, was an imperialist lackey, and I don't know where he got this idea, but he thought that Nehru would actually sell out the communist world, and that he was actually, secretly in league with the British, and none of this makes any sense. But if you read Stalin's internal pronouncements and letters to Molotov about this is where it comes out. He had the same attitude towards Ho Chi Minh, for example, and that came out very well in that story where Mikoyan traveled. Oh, David knows this about the story. We've done some work on this, but Mikoyan traveled to Xibaibo in January, February 1949, and before he traveled, he saw Stalin, and I guess on that basis he jotted down some ideas about. Including about the division of labor for the communist world. And so China was supposed to be responsible for some communist parties, including the Japanese, Korean, right? David, you remember Korean?
Yeah,
Korean,
basically just Northeast Asia.
Northeast Asia, but not Vietnam, for which the French communists were supposed to be responsible for Vietnam. And you think, how could he be so blind to the aspirations of the Vietnamese people, who clearly did not care for being French communist oversight? And then at some point in some of that correspondence, Stalin seemed to have suggested that Ho Chi Minh was actually a Western spy. Which just reflects on Stalin's paranoias. Ho Chi Minh tried to dissuade him. Obviously, he traveled to Moscow and wrote those letters, which we have now in Rogast.
So these are not sort of guys from whom you draw legitimacy, right?
Yeah, well, exactly. He didn't know. He didn't care. He didn't care about these people. Khrushchev cared more about the global South, and Brezhnev also did. Brezhnev really cared about Vietnam in a major kind of way. They have I have a chapter on the Vietnam War here that shows that Vietnam was central to his conception of legitimacy as a communist leader, and in particular in the context of the Sino-Soviet confrontation. So this was Soviet-Vietnam War. He really was worried about Vietnam because he was worried about China.
And the irony is that Nixon thought that both Mao and Brezhnev would bail him out of Vietnam, and he was wrong in both cases.
Sure.
That Brezhnev at various secret party meetings would boast about how much he wanted to make it impossible for the United States to stay in Vietnam. And Mao Zedong made very similar conferences back in Beijing.
Brezhnev misread the situation. But my favorite story about this is that, and that I think highlights. I'll allow myself to tell this anecdote. I don't know how much time we have, but just a couple of minutes.
You can go ahead.
Okay, so Nixon comes to Moscow, and I tell the story in the book. It's really interesting. Nixon comes to Moscow and has a lovely conversation with Brezhnev, which he recounts in his memoirs. And at one point, as Nixon recounts in his memoirs, Brezhnev starts shouting at him, "You are, bloodthirsty American imperialist. You have, what are you doing in Vietnam? Get the hell out of there." And Nixon writes in his memoirs, well, I was so shocked. He was so nice, and suddenly just started shouting, "Oh, what's wrong?" And then, of course, with the use of, and then, by the way, later he just Brezhnev totally switched his attitude, and they had a very nice end to this conversation. Shared pirashki, etc. Had a very good time. But now with the Russian archives opening up this relevant material, you can see what actually happened. So Brezhnev needed this because he needed the transcript of the conversation where he would defend Vietnam.
But Gorny was there.
But Gordon, and he took that transcript to the Vietnamese and said, "Look, we are your true friends." He read out from this transcript during his party meeting in the plenum party and in the party plenum meeting, and then he also showed it to Castro when Castro showed up in Moscow. He really valued Castro's opinion. So Castro, of course, was very suspicious of the Soviet Union selling out Vietnam. So Brezhnev showed him this transcript saying, "Look, we are true to our communist faith." So that shows, I think, how Brezhnev craved recognition from different audiences and how he had to cater to different audiences in different ways, which again just emphasizes this question of recognition, brings us back to this question of recognition and legitimacy.
Okay, so let me open it for questions from the audience. I'm very tempted myself to raise another question with you, Sergey, which in your first book, the Two Suns in the Heaven, which, as you say, came out at more or less the same time that Lawrence Lutey's book on the Sino-Soviet split did. And they cover much of the same territory, but from very different perspectives. Lawrence gives overwhelming emphasis to ideology in his book, whereas you are basically dismissive of it. And frankly, I preferred your interpretation. So in more recent books, you have sort of danced toward looking at ideology, but never, you still are well short of where people like Lawrence was or where Arne Westhead was. And so I'm curious, are you doing that in response to what you find in the documents, or are you doing that simply in response to perhaps people who've criticized you for overlooking it?
Well,
I'm not among them, but
that's interesting. Oh, you mean, am I shifting back towards ideological explanation? I mean, I just think there's
no, I don't think you do.
Yeah.
You do take it more seriously, though.
Well, I do take it seriously because I realize just how complex some of these issues are and how it is difficult to, or sometimes it's actually too easy to get lost in various arguments about what ideology actually means. And so you have to give some credit to this, and you have to kind of try to engage with this and say, well, this actually matters. And because, you can always say that as I do in this book, for example, I say, well, if we define, depending on how we define ideology, if we say that ideology was, let's say, a set of Marxist-Leninist principles as outlined in Das Kapital or the Communist Manifesto, or any number of party resolutions, or any number of Lenin's books, and we'll say this is how they made their foreign policy, I'll say this is nonsense. And Khrushchev, I don't think ever read Das Kapital, so he didn't know what it was about. But if you say that ideology is a worldview that incorporated various aspects of some of this literature, but also, let's say, in relation to China, Orientalist literature, or just blatant racism, or historical experiences, and et cetera, et cetera. In other words, a worldview, then of course it mattered, because how can you claim, or how can I claim, that a worldview does not matter? The worldview is what it accounts for this. But again, this comes down to specific definitions of ideology, and depending on how broad you view you take on this, then you can argue either way. And that's why I used to have those arguments with Lawrence, but that is because I had a very, very narrow view of what ideology is, whereas in this book I try to be more, I guess, flexible and recognize that there are other definitions out there, and depending on what kind of definition you use, you might say, well, you cannot do without ideology, because ideas matter. Ideas matter. And even, for example, I as I show in the book, and that sounds tautological and actually quite ridiculous, but I say that, realism, I used to argue that ideology does not matter, realism matters in Sino-Soviet relations. But in this book, I say, well, actually, realism is an ideology. Isn't that the case? Realism is also an ideology. In other words, it all becomes so fuzzy that you can't actually make any arguments at all. So I kind of try to take a distance from this and say, well, here are some other concepts. Let's put all of these arguments aside, and let's talk about something else entirely, such as this feeling of legitimacy, the feeling or this idea of self-actualization. And that's why in the introduction to the book, I delve into philosophy. I go back to, I don't know if I actually mentioned Plato, but maybe I do. I can't remember now, but I certainly, I think I mentioned Hegel, etc. And this is, that is not something that I would have done in my earlier work, because I simply did not read this stuff or had not read it, and I didn't know anything about it. But now that I've kind of slightly broadened out the things that I have read about, it seemed that only too pertinent, too important, very important to engage with this.
Okay, thank you very much, Sergey. Let me just briefly mention there are flyers here for 20% discount on the book if anyone would like to take one and pass some around here. Tatiana.
Yeah, actually, well, thank you very much. And my question from the early on in your presentation had to do with precisely ideology and your juxtaposition of ideological legitimacy is very fascinating, and it's as you spoke, and I kept thinking that I want to contradict your, but now I come more to agree with you, to see how you define ideology and worldview. As if it is a worldview, then it really coincides with how I see it. And
see, that's what I meant. I should say, once you start arguing the definition, it turns out you agree with everybody.
Yeah, but at the same time, the episodes with Stalin and Nehru, which I was not aware of, or Brezhnev and Nixon, and neither were known to me, show me that perhaps ideology did play an important role in their worldview and how they viewed their counterparts or their adversaries and so forth. And my question is basically, to what extent did this worldview distort their understanding of the outside world? Yeah, I, for example, remember when I was still in Moscow in 1974, I think it was when Jimmy Carter was elected, or was being elected, and or just before the Nixon, the Watergate scandal and so forth. The Soviet press used to portray it as something that would stop at the first knock of the fist of President Nixon on the table. Everything will quiet down and nothing, no scandal, the scandal will be over. And and also reading the documents of KGB on my stepfather, Andrei Sakharov, I became convinced that they have distorted the world, and they fell not in love, but they fell victims to their own disinformation and their own ideological construct. So I'm curious as to what degree you think that was true, and also, if a side question, if any dissenting points of view, including that of Andrei Sakharov or any other dissenters, some of whom later came to completely embrace Putin, for example, like Roy Medvedev, and how did it, if any at all, made any contribution to the better understanding of the world functions?
Mm-hmm.
But let me, before you answer, Sergey, is turn to David Wolf, to I'll collect a few questions and then come back.
Okay. Great book, Sergey. Really builds on the two earlier books, but then a whole next level of sophistication in putting it together. So just tremendous, adding in all that great origami stuff and the Chinese cultural stuff. It's exciting to see it all come together like that. So on the worldview thing, it's a little simplistic, but of course, there's all kinds of things in a worldview. But what you care about most is squaring the circle between ideology and realpolitik.
Mhm.
For that, you really need to just focus on which part of someone's worldview determines how they imagine where power comes from. Is what I say for that. So the Chinese would still tell you they're Marxists, right? Okay, we don't believe they're Marxists, right? They don't believe in equality. Marx believe in the working class. None of that. That's all gone. But they sure believe in technology and economics as the basis for the means of production, which produces power. So that's some place where you can actually square the circle by seeing where they see power coming from. So that's one place where you can connect the ideology, to actually make it work. In real time while telling a historical story is a different matter, but the Chinese are always very conscious of doing this very thing. On the Stalin stuff, this is Sergey's question. Stalin, I think, still continues to learn. And what he does in 45 is not what he's going to do in 50 or 52. He is going to give the Chinese much more control over things. We see that in Argani.
Right.
He really does apportion the east to them. The Indonesian materials now come through the Chinese by the time you get to 52 and 53. So he really does kind of shift.
He changes over time. That's a reflection of them holding Cold War.
And he is starting to connect with India towards the end, 51, 52, 53. He just went before, while the Indian armed forces were still being commanded by a British commander in chief. That for him was, we're not there yet.
Well, you've done a fantastic work on this yourself.
So, that's kind of what I do with that. And the business about the lack of economic legitimacy, you're right. At the end of the 60s, they're seeing that it's failing. They look at the 70 census and they realize that no more Slavs. It's all over. The demography has shifted towards Central Asia. They're very worried about it. But then all of a sudden they get the windfall with the oil. And it's all that Western Siberian oil coming online, the oil price is going up, the dollar is strong, it's all done in dollar. They have it all, but then it's really a choice. They don't choose to spend it on righting their economic situation.
On what, sorry?
They don't invest it in the Soviet economy and in the computer revolution, in R&D. They don't do that. They spend it on all kinds of third world military operations, on building up the armed forces, on developing ballistic missiles in the Sea of Okhotsk, the submarines. Those are choices. They could have tried to go for economic legitimacy in the 70s, but they don't.
So you're arguing that they should have taken the approach that Deng Xiaoping did. Is that right?
Deng Xiaoping would have said that.
That's a very interesting point, David. I'll come back to that.
And regarding China, I think that you're largely saying what you see in your documents on the Russian side. No, I don't think it's your bias. I think the Russians really care about China for the whole 20th century. They found the Japanese and the Chinese parties at the same time. Japan has much more of a proletariat, has much more of an industry, but that's not where the potential is. They focus on.
You don't think I have a
Let me
selection
have you
bias?
address both of these things. Sergey, both questions. So first, Tatiana.
Oh, Tatiana, okay. So distortion, Tatiana, thank you very much for that. Distortion of the world. Distortion of the world happens with any worldview, because what is a worldview? Worldview is a set of lenses that you use to perceive reality. No matter what lenses you use, you will have some sort of distortion. I don't think that you can arrive at a worldview that is completely free. I mean, that's a philosophical problem, right? That's a philosophical problem that goes well beyond our discussion today. So yes, of course, the Soviets distorted the world because of their, particular views, and this distortion was in part can be seen as a function of their own experience, the way they approach the world, their historical memories, their cultural background. Is that not important? Of course it's important. Cultural background was important. And, maybe, yes, what they read in the Das Kapital, those of them who read it, which was not everyone. So the question for me was, in making specific policies, pursuing specific policies, what specific lenses and what specific distortions did they apply, and where did those distortions come from? So when I looked at the relationship with China and Brezhnev's obsession with China, his absolute fixation on China, I could say, well, how does that make sense from a Marxist-Leninist perspective? And frankly, it doesn't actually make any sense from the Marxist-Leninist perspective. In 1965, Kosygin actually thought that it didn't make sense that they were quarreling. So he went to meet with Mao Zedong in Beijing, only to learn, as Mao Zedong told him, that the struggle will last for 10,000 years. A very well-known episode. And then you basically have effectively a war between two allegedly communist powers in 1969. And then you have another one between allegedly communist powers in 1979 when China invades Vietnam. I don't know. You can also maybe say that Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia is yet another one. I mean, anyway, the communist powers went to war all the time. And how do you explain that from the point of view of communist ideology? It doesn't really make sense. So you have to apply other lenses to understand how they distorted their perceptions in different ways. And the way I approached, for example, China was this issue of cultural background, racism, etc. That really played a huge role. I think a much greater role than some precepts that Brezhnev would have derived from reading Marxist-Leninist literature. I don't mean that it's just the only thing that mattered. Other things also matter. Brezhnev's approach to the United States was also distorted badly. And he had this interesting, I asked myself this question of where did he get his information about the United States, which is kind of interesting. Turns out he got it from Gus Hall. A lot of his information came from Gus Hall, which was the leader of the Communist Party. And so he would bring this back to the Politburo and he would say, well, the Americans, America is such a terrible place. You can be killed for $5 if you just walk through the streets. And anyway, the Americans, they are so lazy and all they do is watch the TV and they don't understand anything about the world. And how
didn't he get it right?
Sorry.
But this is shocking. I thought he would get his information from the brain.
But apparently he would recite. So he would meet with Gus Hall because sometimes he would have these conversations with other people where he would say these things about the United States, and you think, well, where the hell did he bring? Where did he get this information? And then when you look at his conversation with Gus Hall, you realize where Gus Hall would tell him.
Shocking.
Yeah, this is what's happening in the United States. And he was, did you know, in America, they sort of eat people in the street. So that's sort of that is about distortion. So yes, distortions matter. I mean, everything is a distortion. But I guess that I'm not trying to follow a completely relativist approach in the book. I don't mean that all distortions were equally distorted. Some maybe were closer to reality. I think I don't want to take a nihilist approach.
It's a very relativist view, isn't it?
That's right. So I definitely don't do that. On David's point, where does power come from? Well, we have an answer from Comrade Mao. Political power comes from the barrel of a gun.
Only during the war.
Only during the war. Fundamentally, I think they still do. think that political power comes out of the barrel of a gun. That's the bottom line argument. It's not even about economy. It's about who holds the guns, and that's why you have, the leader of the party relinquishes the position of the chairman of the Central Military Commission, the last, right, as Deng Xiaoping did in his time. But here's an interesting question. If you say political power comes out of a barrel of a gun, you might say, well, this is a part of Maoist canon, not, I don't know, maybe not Marxist, but Maoist. It's the most cited thing from Mao. Everybody knows that, right? What is Maoism? Political power comes out of a barrel of a gun. But basically what this means is that might makes right. And this is a realist concept. It's a realist concept. It's not, it's not, I don't know if it's a Marxist concept, but it certainly can be traced to the Athenian generals of Melos, the strong exact what they can and the weak grant what they must, especially if the strong have the guns. And that's what made them strong, because they have the guns. So in this sense, you have a central concept of Maoism. Political power comes out of a barrel of a gun that is just directly can be linked to similar philosophical discussions in the Peloponnesian Wars that predate any kind of Marxism by 2,500 years. So that is where it becomes very, very complicated. You might say, well, okay, so Stalin believed in the inevitability of war, and that's a well-known thesis. He believed in the inevitability of war, and you might say, well, this is a Marxist proposition, because after all, he believed in the inevitability of war because, all this capitalists, they struggle for markets, therefore there's going to be a war. Or you might say, actually, he believed in the inevitability of war because he was such a dark personality, paranoid, and he felt that, people always struggle for power, and therefore you'll have a war because you have constant struggle for power. And that is a less of a Marxist concept, I suppose, than the other one. Basically, they overlapped in some ways, and we can fall back on Vlad Sumov's characterization here. Of Soviet foreign policy, yeah.
Okay.
Well, but there's something about oil. There's oil, because David raised a very pertinent question about where did they invest? I actually was struck, and not in this book, but while writing this book, I recognized that my lack of knowledge of economic history is a huge, huge handicap, because actually economics, it was the economy stupid, including for the Soviets, not just for the United States throughout the Cold War. And in particular, I recognized the enormous importance of oil and gas in Soviet foreign policy, which is why today, in the way of advertisement for my next book, I'm actually writing a book about the role of oil and gas in Soviet and Russian foreign policies. I started in the 1950s, and I show how the discovery of oil in Tatarstan first, actually during wartime years, in approximately 1943, and then obviously Western Siberia, provided this new source of legitimacy, but also capital for the Soviets to try to build up their economy when they didn't really have any other sources. So if you read the stories about Brezhnev, or the records of Brezhnev's conversations with American businessmen, the likes of Armand Hammer, who else showed up there? And there's all kinds of people that will show up in Moscow, including, by the way, Nixon and Kissinger. Brezhnev would paint this wonderful vistas of pipelines, of how, the Soviet Union was going to export natural gas to the United States. And this was going to be the foundation of detente. And he was already, he had all kinds of great projects in mind worth billions and billions and billions of dollars, which he never managed to sell to Nixon, but at least he wanted to do that. And then you have a parallel story is from the 1960s. Increasingly, you have the Soviets beginning the export of gas. Really, well, it starts with oil, the friendship pipeline, but then gas to their allies, but also increasingly to Western Europe. So when you come to 1968, the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, what happens 2 weeks after the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia? Oh, they opened the first pipeline to Austria. The Austrians, literally 2 weeks after the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, the Soviets take Austrian gas. Sorry, the other way around. The Austrians take the Soviet gas. And then, the story of the 1970s is also intricately connected to the Soviet idea of selling oil and gas to Western Europe, and then using that to do what exactly? To build up their military to some extent, yes, because those were the requirements of a great power, and Brezhnev constantly talked about it. We have to be a great power, which includes military power, but also importing entire Western plants. And that was shocked when I saw just how much of what I thought was always, Soviet achievements were actually built by Americans or some Western companies, like the KAMAZ plant, for example, or what else? There are lots of examples like that. And you think, wow, this is really crazy. So it's like that joke. Remember that joke where Nixon comes to Moscow and Brezhnev tells them, okay, we want to buy, American automobile technology. So, okay, let's just sign an agreement. All this fine, and we want to import American computers. Okay, let's sign an agreement. And then he says, well, we want to buy American grain. Okay, and so Nixon says, okay, let's just conclude an agreement that the United States undertakes to build communism in the USSR. An overarching agreement, and it's funny, but it's true.
So KAMAZ was American?
Yeah, Herb Levine has a good book on that. Herbert Levine.
I got stuck in the 1920s with the Dnipro gas, okay.
Another example.
His book on Soviet Union and American technology is something like that. Goes through a long series.
Yeah, they would buy and sometimes steal American technology, not just American, the Japanese technology as well. Remember the Toshiba scandal where they bought propellers from Toshiba? I mean, the Japanese totally knew what this was for, right? But they bought, no, it wasn't propellers. It was the milling machines to make propellers, which says we need it for our shipping, which of course was actually for nuclear submarines. And that led to this famous episode where American congressmen were smashing Toshibas on the steps of the US Congress.
Okay, we ran a few minutes over, but I want to thank Sergey Radchenko, thank Serhiy Plokhy, and thank the audience for coming. So